In 2015, Elizabeth Holmes was hailed as the next Steve Jobs. She wore the same black turtlenecks, spoke with a deep, authoritative voice, and promised to revolutionize healthcare. Her company, Theranos, claimed it could run hundreds of blood tests with just a single drop of blood. Investors poured in billions. Media outlets crowned her a visionary. And at 31, she became the world's youngest self-made female billionaire, with a net worth estimated at $4.5 billion. But only a few years later, the world would discover a very different story. Theranos' groundbreaking technology didn't work. Behind the sleek marketing and billion-dollar valuations were unreliable machines, manipulated test results, and patients misled about their health. The woman once praised as a genius entrepreneur was exposed as the mastermind of one of Silicon Valley's greatest frauds. The fall was as dramatic as the rise. Holmes went from magazine covers and boardrooms filled with powerful men, including former U.S. Secretaries of State and defense officials, to criminal trials and ultimately a prison sentence. Her story shocked the world not only because of the scale of the deception, but because it revealed how easily ambition, charisma, and image could blind even the smartest investors and institutions. How did Elizabeth Holmes go from a bright Stanford dropout with a dream to a convicted fraudster? What secrets of psychology, persuasion, and unchecked ambition fueled her meteoric rise and her catastrophic fall? This is the story of Elizabeth Holmes, the youngest female billionaire who promised to change the world, and the scandal that proved she had built her empire on lies. Elizabeth Ann Holmes was born on February 3, 1984 in Washington, D.C., into a family that prized ambition, legacy, and achievement. Her father, Christian Holmes IV, worked in government agencies like USAID, and her mother, Noelle Holmes, was a congressional committee staffer. Though not wealthy by Silicon Valley standards, the Holmes family carried themselves with the weight of history. They often reminded Elizabeth of their lineage, tracing back to the Fleischman family, once influential in American business. From an early age, she grew up with the sense that she was destined for greatness. As a child, Elizabeth was quiet, intensely focused, and precociously intelligent. She loved to read and was fascinated by science and invention. Her relatives recalled how she would immerse herself in books about Thomas Edison and admired innovators who reshaped the world. Unlike many children who played with toys, Elizabeth dreamed of building machines and solving big problems. From the beginning, she also displayed unusual ambition. When asked as a little girl what she wanted to be when she grew up, she reportedly replied, "I want to be a billionaire." For Elizabeth, success was not just about achievement. It was about scale, power, and legacy. Her family nurtured her drive. They encouraged discipline and hard work, enrolling her in Chinese language classes and pushing her academically. By her teenage years, she was already studying Mandarin intensively, eventually spending a summer in Beijing to immerse herself in the language. Friends recall that she was serious beyond her years, speaking often about her desire to do something world-changing. In high school, Elizabeth excelled in math and science, though she wasn't considered a prodigy in the traditional sense. What set her apart was her relentless determination. She would work late into the night, driven by an almost obsessive need to prove herself. Teachers remembered her as intense, ambitious, and laser-focused on her goals. Her father's career at USAID exposed her to global issues, particularly public health challenges in developing countries. Elizabeth became fascinated with the idea of using science and technology to improve lives. This early exposure planted the seed of a mission she would later claim as her own, to revolutionize healthcare and make it more accessible. In 2002, Elizabeth enrolled at Stanford University, one of the most prestigious schools in the world, to study chemical engineering. At just 18, she immersed herself in the world of innovation, surrounding herself with professors and researchers at the cutting edge of science. She worked in research labs, filed her first patent application for a wearable drug delivery patch, and impressed mentors with her determination. But even at Stanford, her ambition stood out. While many of her peers were content to study and plan for careers in academia or industry, Elizabeth wanted to create something bigger. She idolized figures like Steve Jobs and Bill Gates, who had dropped out of college to build world-changing companies. To her, staying in school felt like delay. By her sophomore year, Elizabeth made a bold decision. She dropped out of Stanford to pursue her vision full-time. With her professor's support, she launched a company called Theranos, based on the idea that a small drop of blood could replace traditional vials for diagnostic testing. It was a concept that promised to save lives, cut costs, and disrupt an entire industry. Looking back, Elizabeth Holmes' childhood and youth weren't marked by hardship, but by a potent mix of privilege, encouragement, and towering ambition. She was not the outcast or underdog often found in Silicon Valley myths. Instead, she was the child who always believed she was destined for greatness. A belief so strong that it carried her to the edge of glory and ultimately to disaster. The girl who once declared she wanted to be a billionaire was already on her way, but the foundation of her dream, as the world would later learn, was far shakier than anyone imagined. In 2013, at just 19 years old, Elizabeth Holmes made the decision that would define her life. She dropped out of Stanford University during her sophomore year, convinced that education would only slow her down. With a mixture of youthful boldness and extraordinary confidence, she founded Theranos, a name she derived from therapy and diagnosis. Her vision was clear: to revolutionize blood testing with a device that could run hundreds of diagnostic tests from just a single drop of blood. At the time, the idea was groundbreaking. Traditional blood tests required vials of blood, drawn with needles, sent to labs, and processed over days. Holmes promised to make the process faster, cheaper, and less invasive. It was a mission that combined humanitarian appeal with massive business potential. She framed it not just as a company, but as a crusade to democratize healthcare. Her charisma and determination quickly attracted attention. She secured early funding from family connections and Stanford professors impressed by her conviction. By 2004, Theranos had raised millions in venture capital. Holmes surrounded herself with influential mentors, including Channing Robertson, a respected Stanford engineering professor who became the company's first board member. But what set Holmes apart was not just her idea, it was her image. Inspired by Steve Jobs, she adopted his trademark black turtleneck uniform, lowering her voice to sound more authoritative and projecting a calm, almost messianic confidence. She positioned herself not only as a CEO, but as a visionary. Media outlets seized on the narrative: a young, blonde Stanford dropout leading a healthcare revolution. She was hailed as the next Steve Jobs, and the story was too compelling for Silicon Valley and later Wall Street to resist. By the early 2010s, Theranos had entered the spotlight. Holmes pitched her technology to investors, corporations, and even the US military. She claimed that the company's proprietary device, nicknamed the Edison, could run over 200 tests using just a finger prick of blood. The potential impact was staggering: early cancer detection, affordable testing for the poor, rapid diagnosis in war zones. Holmes spoke not only of business, but of saving lives. Investors responded with enthusiasm. Theranos raised hundreds of millions of dollars from some of the most prominent names in business. At its peak, the company was valued at $9 billion, and Holmes herself was declared the world's youngest self-made female billionaire, with a personal net worth of $4.5 billion. Part of Theranos' allure lay in its extraordinary board of directors. Holmes surrounded herself with some of the most powerful men in America, including former Secretaries of State Henry Kissinger and George Shultz, former Defense Secretary James Mattis,
and former Wells Fargo CEO Richard Kovacevich. The presence of such figures lent credibility to the company, even though few of them had any background in medicine or science. Their reputations, combined with Holmes' charisma, created a fortress of legitimacy that shielded Theranos from scrutiny. The media adored her. Forbes, Fortune, and Time splashed her face across their covers. She was named to the Time 100 list of most influential people. In interviews, Holmes spoke with conviction about her mission. "I don't want to make an incremental change. I want to create a whole new paradigm of healthcare." For a world hungry for innovation, especially in medicine, her story was irresistible. But behind the scenes, cracks were already forming. Engineers and scientists inside Theranos struggled to make the Edison machines work. The technology was unreliable, producing inconsistent and often inaccurate results. Many employees raised concerns, but Holmes and her partner and COO, Ramesh Sunny Belwani, silenced dissent. Employees who questioned too much were fired or intimidated with aggressive legal threats. Still, the illusion held. Holmes signed deals with major corporations like Walgreens and Safeway, promising to place Theranos testing machines in pharmacies and clinics across America. Patients would soon be able to walk into their local drugstore, prick a finger, and get instant results for everything from cholesterol levels to cancer markers. It was the future of medicine, packaged neatly in a sleek little box. By 2014, Theranos was at its peak. The company's valuations soared, Holmes was celebrated on international stages, and investors clamored for a piece of the revolution. She was portrayed as a trailblazer for women in tech, a genius entrepreneur breaking barriers in a male-dominated industry. For a brief moment, Elizabeth Holmes seemed untouchable. Her rise to fame was meteoric, but it was built less on scientific breakthroughs than on storytelling, image, and relentless persuasion. She mastered the art of Silicon Valley hype, promising bold visions of the future while delivering just enough to keep doubt at bay. She embodied the mantra of "fake it till you make it," except in her case, the stakes weren't just apps or gadgets, but human lives. Elizabeth Holmes had become a billionaire and a global icon.
At its height, Theranos appeared untouchable. Elizabeth Holmes was celebrated as a genius. Investors were dazzled, and the media praised her as a symbol of innovation and female leadership. But behind the sleek image lay a darker reality, a company built on fear, secrecy, and a technology that simply didn't work. Inside Theranos, the atmosphere was tense and paranoid. Holmes and her COO, Sunny Balwani, ran the company with an iron grip. Employees were divided into silos, forbidden from discussing their work across teams. Engineers who tried to raise concerns about the Edison machine's failures were met with hostility. Some were forced to sign strict non-disclosure agreements. Others were fired abruptly. Dissent was not tolerated. The culture thrived on intimidation, with threats of lawsuits against those who dared to question or leave. The truth was damning. The Edison devices could not reliably perform the hundreds of tests Holmes promised. At best, they could run a handful, often inaccurately. In many cases, Theranos secretly relied on traditional commercial machines, diluting samples to disguise the limitations of its own technology. Patients who thought they were receiving revolutionary testing were in reality receiving flawed results, sometimes dangerously so. Yet Holmes pressed forward, using charm and persuasion to maintain the illusion. She insisted that breakthroughs were just around the corner, that critics simply didn't understand the vision. She invoked secrecy, not as a cover-up, but as a necessity to protect intellectual property. For years, this narrative worked. Investors and board members trusted her, the public admired her, and regulators, dazzled by her connections and the company's potential, failed to press deeper. But cracks began to widen. In 2015, the Wall Street Journal published a groundbreaking exposé by journalist John Carreyrou.
The investigation revealed that Theranos' technology was deeply flawed and that the company had misled patients, investors, and partners. The article triggered shockwaves across Silicon Valley and the medical community. Holmes fought back aggressively, denying the allegations and attempting to discredit Carreyrou. She appeared on television, insisting that Theranos' devices were revolutionary and that skeptics simply wanted the company to fail. For a brief time, her charisma and defiance kept some supporters loyal, but evidence mounted quickly. Whistleblowers, including former employees like Tyler Schultz, the grandson of board member George Schultz, came forward with damning testimonies. Lawsuits piled up, partnerships collapsed, and regulators finally intervened. The consequences were severe. Walgreens terminated its deal with Theranos, and Safeway followed. Patients who had received false test results expressed outrage. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, CMS, banned Holmes from operating a lab for 2 years. Investors realized they had been misled, and billions of dollars evaporated. What made the downfall so shocking was not just the scale of the deception, but the stakes. This was not a failed app or a delayed gadget. It was healthcare. People had made medical decisions based on Theranos' faulty test. Lives had been put at risk. The narrative of a young visionary saving the world unraveled into one of the most infamous frauds in Silicon Valley history. Holmes herself became a lightning rod for criticism. Her image, once carefully crafted to echo Steve Jobs, now seemed like theater. The black turtlenecks, the deepened voice, and the unwavering eye contact all were reinterpreted as manipulative tools designed to project authority she did not earn. The very charisma that once won over billionaires and statesmen was now viewed as evidence of deception. In 2018, the SEC charged Holmes and Baldwani with massive fraud. Prosecutors alleged that they had deliberately misled investors, patients, and doctors about the capabilities of Theranos' technology. Holmes agreed to settle the SEC charges, surrendering control and paying fines, but the criminal case pressed forward. The dark side of Holmes' story isn't just about lies. It's about ambition unchecked. She believed so strongly in her vision, or at least in her ability to sell it, that she crossed the line between aspiration and deception. Her company's collapse destroyed her reputation, devastated employees, and shook Silicon Valley's culture of hype. The empire Holmes built on promises came crashing down, and for the world, the Theranos scandal became a cautionary tale, a reminder that in the pursuit of innovation, charisma and ambition can sometimes blind even the smartest investors, and that the cost of deception in healthcare is measured not only in dollars, but in lives. By 2016, the illusion that Elizabeth Holmes had so carefully constructed was collapsing under the weight of undeniable truth. The US government, investors, patients, and the media no longer bought into the promise of Theranos. The company, once valued at $9 billion, had become synonymous with deception. For Holmes, the prodigy once celebrated as a visionary, the stage was now a courtroom. The climax of Holmes' story began with relentless investigations. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services revoked Theranos' license to operate a lab. The SEC accused Holmes and Sunny Balwani of orchestrating an elaborate years-long fraud. The Department of Justice followed with criminal charges of wire fraud and conspiracy. The allegations were staggering, that Holmes had knowingly misled investors, partners, and patients about Theranos' technology, raising over $700 million on false claims. As the world watched, Holmes transformed from Silicon Valley icon to defendant fighting for her freedom. Once accustomed to adoring magazine covers and TED-style stages, she now sat in a courtroom, her every word dissected. The black turtlenecks remained, but the aura of invincibility was gone. The trial that began in 2021 became one of the most closely watched in modern business history.
prosecutors painted Holmes as a manipulative leader who deliberately lied to secure funding and power. They showed evidence of doctor reports, misleading demonstrations, and repeated false claims about partnerships with companies like Walgreens and the U.S. military. Witnesses, from whistleblowers to former employees, testified about the culture of fear and deception inside Theranos. Holmes' defense argued a different narrative, that she was a young, overly optimistic entrepreneur who truly believed in her vision. They suggested she was manipulated by Sunny Balwani, her older partner and COO, who controlled and intimidated her. Holmes herself took the stand, a rare move, describing a toxic personal and professional relationship with Balwani. It was an attempt to shift the story from deliberate fraud to tragic naivete. But the jury was not convinced. In January 2022, Elizabeth Holmes was convicted on 4 counts of fraud and conspiracy. Each count carried a potential sentence of up to 20 years in prison. The verdict sent shockwaves through Silicon Valley and beyond. For years, tech culture had thrived on the mantra of "fake it till you make it," rewarding bold promises and disruptive visions. Holmes had pushed that ethos to its extreme, and now she was paying the price. In May 2023, Holmes reported to a federal prison in Texas to begin serving an 11-year sentence. It was the ultimate fall. From gracing the cover of Forbes as the world's youngest female self-made billionaire to becoming inmate number 24965-111. The symbolism was stark. Holmes had once embodied the promise of Silicon Valley: innovation, disruption, a new generation of leadership. Her fall embodied its dangers: unchecked ambition, blind trust in charisma, and the absence of accountability. For patients who had relied on Theranos' faulty tests, the damage was not abstract. Misdiagnosed conditions, false reassurances, and unnecessary panic were the human costs of Holmes' deception. For investors, billions were lost. For Silicon Valley, the scandal was a reckoning, forcing the world to question the culture of hype and the dangers of elevating personalities above proven science. The climax of Elizabeth Holmes' story is not just her conviction, but the sheer magnitude of her fall. She went from celebrated genius to convicted fraud in less than a decade, her name forever etched alongside the greatest scandals in business history. And as the prison gates closed behind her, the lesson was clear. Ambition without truth is not vision, but destruction. Elizabeth Holmes' legacy is one of the most controversial in modern business history. She was once celebrated as a trailblazer, the youngest female self-made billionaire, a visionary who promised to change healthcare for the better. Today, she is remembered as the architect of one of Silicon Valley's most notorious frauds. Her story is not one of triumph, but of warning. At the heart of Holmes' legacy is the danger of unchecked ambition. Her vision to run hundreds of blood tests from a single drop was seductive because it addressed a real need. Patients, doctors, and investors desperately wanted it to be true. But Holmes blurred the line between aspiration and deception. She embodied the Silicon Valley mantra of "fake it till you make it." But in medicine, where lives are at stake, that ethos became catastrophic. Her downfall exposed critical flaws in the startup ecosystem. Investors poured billions into Theranos with minimal due diligence, swayed more by Holmes' charisma and her star-studded board than by hard science. Media outlets amplified the myth, eager for the story of a young female Steve Jobs. Regulators failed to intervene quickly enough. In this sense, Theranos was not only Holmes' failure, but also a collective failure of an industry intoxicated by hype. Yet, her legacy also leaves behind valuable lessons. Transparency is non-negotiable. Bold visions must be backed by evidence, especially in fields that affect human health. Charisma is not proof. Investors and partners must look beyond image and narrative to demand scientific validation. Ethics must guide ambition.
Innovation without integrity is not progress, but peril. Culture matters. Theranos' culture of fear and secrecy prevented employees from speaking up until it was too late. Holmes' story also had a gendered dimension. At her peak, she was celebrated as a pioneer for women in tech, a field dominated by men. After her fall, some argued she was judged more harshly because of her gender. Others countered that her fraud damaged women entrepreneurs by fueling skepticism. Either way, her rise and fall revealed how narratives of identity can amplify both admiration and backlash. In the broader cultural sense, Holmes has become a symbol of ambition gone wrong, of the cult of personality in Silicon Valley, and of the dangers of blind trust in innovation. Her life inspired books, documentaries, and dramatizations, not as tales of inspiration, but as cautionary sagas. Even as she serves her prison sentence, the ripple effects of her actions continue to shape business and technology. Startups now face greater scrutiny, investors demand more rigorous proof, and regulators are quicker to question bold claims. The legacy of Elizabeth Holmes is not the revolution she promised, but the skepticism she left behind. Perhaps the most enduring lesson is this: it is not enough to dream of changing the world. One must also respect the truth. Holmes dreamed big, but when the science failed to match her ambition, she chose deception instead of honesty. That choice destroyed her company, her reputation, and her freedom. Elizabeth Holmes will likely never escape the shadow of Theranos. Her name, once spoken alongside words like visionary and genius, will now forever be linked to fraud and scandal. Yet, in that legacy of failure lies an important reminder for entrepreneurs, investors, and dreamers everywhere. Innovation without truth is a house of cards, destined to collapse.
The story of Elizabeth Holmes is one of the most shocking in Silicon Valley's history. From being hailed as the youngest female self-made billionaire to standing trial for fraud, her journey reminds us how ambition without integrity can lead to destruction. Theranos promised to change the world, but instead, it became a cautionary tale of deception, hype, and the dangers of believing in dreams without proof. Yet within the scandal lie lessons that are too important to ignore. The need for transparency, the importance of ethics and innovation, and the responsibility that comes with power. Holmes' rise and fall forces us to ask, what kind of leaders do we want shaping the future of technology and healthcare? If this story made you think differently about ambition, truth, and responsibility, there are many more journeys to explore. Subscribe to Billionaire Secrets to uncover the hidden truths behind the world's most powerful figures, their triumphs, their failures, and the lessons they leave behind. And share your thoughts below. What do you think is the biggest lesson from Elizabeth Holmes' story? Your voice might inspire someone else to see success and failure in a new light.